The UN Security Council has met in New York to discuss the situation in Venezuela. U.S. envoy for Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, called for more sanctions on Caracas. In response, Russian Representative Vasily Nebenzia raised the U.S. history of military interventions and called other countries naive for supporting the U.S. position.
Maduro and his cronies and some in this body claim that delivering humanitarian assistance is a political show.
What took place on Saturday was reminiscent not of help, but by what the U.S. calls force-feeding. Apparently, having trained on Guantanamo prisoners, the American authorities decided to force-feed the whole country.
We ask that others join us in sanctioning those who've been involved in the violence over the last weekend.
Instead of a hypocritical attempt to introduce assistance for $20 million, it is necessary to lift the blocking of accounts of Venezuelan state-owned enterprises in American banks, which totals $11 billion. What about Venezuelan gold in Great Britain? Washington and London just recently stole $30 billion from the Venezuelan people in oil and bank assets.
A lot of money is owed to Russia, and you are no doubt worrying whether that money is going to be repaid.
I am addressing the countries that have supported the self-proclaimed president, Juan Guaido. Are you so naive that you think you have immunity from things like this? Do you think that you will not be next in line?
I reject from top to bottom accusations of military intervention from a country that is occupying the territory of Georgia and Ukraine, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, in Crimea.
Against the background of what you are doing in Venezuela, your accusations just sound ridiculous.
Well, as you just heard, it was a rather tense atmosphere as we heard from the 15 members of the UN Security Council addressing the meeting on Venezuela. Now, it's important to note that the representative of the United States who took the floor on behalf of the United States, as you just saw, was Elliot Abrams. And Elliot Abrams has quite a history in Latin America, south of the U.S. border. He apparently was convicted for misrepresenting and essentially lying to Congress regarding his work and support for organizations in Nicaragua that engaged in violent terrorism with the intention of overthrowing the Sandinista government during the 1980s. Elliot Abrams was also apparently involved in the shipping in of weapons into Nicaragua under the guise of humanitarian aid. Now, the foreign minister of Venezuela spoke, and he pointed out that these humanitarian aid convoys seem to have some rather suspicious content. Here is what he said.
In here, we also have trucks. And let me tell you that when the truck was inspected, there wasn't just food and medicine in the truck. There was equipment for barricades. There was nails. This is what was in the truck. Nails, wire. When security forces inspected, this is what they found. We have information from friendly countries, like Cuba and Russia, that weapons are being bought in Eastern Europe to be given to the opposition, with the aim of staging an armed intervention in Venezuela.
So he was going over the fact that it appears that these trucks, supposedly containing humanitarian aid, had other content within them, content that could have been used for violence and destabilization in Venezuela. He also brought photographs before the UN Security Council showing and seeming to indicate that essentially these aid trucks that were caught on fire were lit by anti-Maduro and anti-Venezuelan government activists. He also showed photographs of various Molotov cocktails, flaming bottles that were brought to the event for the purpose of lighting a fire and causing unrest. He essentially argued that this was a provoked situation and that Venezuela was being provoked on its borders. Now, there were clear divisions in the international community among different countries that addressed the meeting. Some countries were recognizing Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela as a result of the fact that he was elected. However, other countries seem to be lending their support to Juan Guaido and the opposition. Juan Guaido is now in Colombia, and he's getting the support of the United States and proclaiming himself to be the leader.
To discuss the showdown in the Security Council, we have Gabriel Hetland, who is the Assistant Professor of Latin American Studies at the State University of New York. Thanks for being with us here on RT International. So,
Glad you.
During the sessions that we heard Elliot Abrams speaking, he insisted on allowing in humanitarian aid to help the Venezuelan people with the Russian envoy, charging the U.S. and U.K. with stealing $30 billion of the country's oil and bank assets. Do you think the U.S. position is hypocritical in this case?
It clearly is. The U.S. is engaged in oil sanctions against Venezuela, which is by far and away the main source of revenue for the entire country. And that's going to be costing the government, even people who are, very strong critics of the Maduro administration, such as Francisco Rodriguez of Torino Economics, says that's going to cost the government billions and billions of dollars and could easily lead to a famine. So then turning around and offering supposed humanitarian aid is the essence of hypocrisy on the part of the U.S.
So Abrams also said that more sanctions against Venezuela are coming. How do you think that this will influence the Venezuelan economy?
The economy has been in a tailspin for years and years, but particularly since August 2017, when the U.S. tightened sanctions and effectively prevented Venezuela from securing debt in most of the world, the economy's gotten even worse. And so any further sanctions that target the economy will harm ordinary Venezuelans profoundly, and there's a real risk of famine if sanctions continue for a long time.
Well, Venezuela's foreign minister showed pictures of trucks, which he said were U.S. aid trucks, but were actually filled with wire and nails. And of course, wire and nails doesn't always necessarily say nefarious activity, but is it at least suspicious?
Certainly. I haven't seen the images, and I can't comment exactly. What I've seen suggests that the trucks had mostly food. They didn't have medicine as they were supposed to have. This is according to a Twitter feed from a New York Times reporter who actually was down there. But obviously, I think the U.S. has a history of using humanitarian aid for nefarious purposes, so that can't be discounted. And more than that, I mean, we don't need to sort of parse tea leaves to know that the U.S. is openly calling for regime change in Venezuela, and the humanitarian aid is clearly and very openly, explicitly designed to bring that about. So it's not a secret that the U.S. Is not primarily interested in helping the Venezuelan people, but rather in removing the government of Nicolas Maduro, who I myself have strong critiques of, but don't think the U.S. has a right to be involved in regime change with.
All right, now the Trump administration says Cuba and Nicaragua are next. Whatever that means. Are the countries supporting Guaido acknowledging Washington's right to choose the governments of other nations as well?
Effectively, they are. I mean, I don't think that so many of the governments that are supporting Guaido would want that to happen. And it's important to note that there are some visible splits. Even Alvaro Uribe, a far-right politician in Colombia, the former president there, has come out against U.S. military intervention. So it's clear that there's some discontent and there's some sort of second guessing happening within the so-called coalition supporting the U.S. But if they go through in supporting that, they would effectively be sanctioning the U.S.'s ability to engage in regime change.